here's some background on Gregg because it is very, very cool. So he's the executive director of the Grable Foundation, a father and a children's advocate, and he has been inspired by Fred Rogers. Me too. I mean, who hasn't been inspired by Fred? For more than a decade, he has helped lead Remake Learning, and we'll learn more about Remake Learning. He is based in Pittsburgh, but Remake Learning has become a leader in the field, helping people all the way from the Forbes to the World Economic Forum, focused on encouraging children's curiosity and wonder, but also with a very strong emphasis on fostering justice and belonging in schools, all the areas where we learn. But the thing that I'm very curious about, that he has written a book, and we're going to talk about that a little bit later, but I love the title. The book is When You Wonder, You Are Learning. So that's all what we're about. Welcome, Gregg.
It's so great to be with you, Tara. You know, one of the blessings of this Zooming times is that we can connect in this way. So I'm grateful to be here with you.
Yeah, so start us off and tell us, what is Remake Learning?
Yeah, so first of all, you mentioned Pittsburgh. So let me situate you in southwestern Pennsylvania and northern West Virginia. And it's in this region that over the past nearly 15 years, thousands of educators in and out of school, early childhood through higher education and beyond, have sought to pursue relevant, engaging, equitable learning for young people and the experiences everywhere they go, recognizing that learning happens everywhere. And so what is it that we can do to support first grade teachers working with roboticists in new ways, or technologists working with librarians? And how do we create more remarkable learning experiences and learning pathways for kids? And so as we sit here in 2021, there are more than 600 schools, museums, libraries, early learning centers, campuses of higher education, and creative industries that are commonly working to support a remarkable learning landscape here in this region. And that's done through a mix of catalytic grant making, bringing people together in working groups around computer science or personalized learning or STEAM education in our region, organizing delegations, lots of communications, just pot stirring to create the atmosphere for learning that we want for young people, their families, and educators all across our region.
Yeah, I love the term pot stirring. So do you know if something like this has been replicated in any other region?
It has, and we didn't set out to create a learning ecosystem, but that phrase is something that has certainly captured attention both domestically here in the United States and around the world when you look at the work of Innovation Unit or WISE as examples. And so there are places internationally like Doncaster in England, or Barcelona, or Christchurch in New Zealand, that are definitely thinking in a systematic way to create learning ecosystems. In the United States, I'd look to a place like Chattanooga and Hamilton County and what they've done through their Public Education Foundation, in Chicago with the Chicago Learning Exchange, in San Diego with their Office of Education. There are places, again, across America and across the world that I think are thinking more broadly about what constitutes schooling and education, right? To really create more dynamic learning landscapes supportive of their young people. And one of the great things is we're increasingly connected to one another and really learning from one another about creating a new learning dynamic to support our kids.
I spent some time looking at like the role of geography in bringing like innovators together, and like I think people wonder, how can we replicate Silicon Valley elsewhere? But I'm wondering, is there something about the geography of Allegheny County where the distance between different learning centers is optimal? Because whenever I talk to somebody from Pittsburgh, it's very clear that there's a pride, there's a sense of belonging to a learning community, which I haven't seen elsewhere. And that's why I'm wondering, is there some magical mix there that is not being accounted for?
Well, I like to think there's magic. I'm not sure there's magic, right? I do love this corner of the world, but this work is replicable. And in fact, it was the Obama White House in 2015 who came to us and said, hey, Pittsburgh, there's something going on there. Can you document your work in a way that might help you, but might be instructive to other places around the world? And so at remakelearning.org, you'll find the Remake Learning Playbook. And some of those places that I mentioned and others have used that playbook in their own context and circumstance. But to
And
context, you're right, Tara, right? I mean, Pittsburgh in so many ways is a 40-year overnight success story. I mean, it was an industrial area that collapsed. And so there's work that's gone on here for decades, not just in education, but in the economy, in medicine, in health, and other fields to rebuild who we are and what we want to be. And I think part of that rebuilding over the past 40 years has bridged relationships that might otherwise have been siloed and separate.
So we should move on because this was just question one in a long list. So I'm worried now. But like I was thinking, I think this is a 3-hour interview, not to scare people who are calling in. So tell us what COVID was like, because I also know the demographics of your community are very, very diverse. And I'm curious, what was it like?
Yeah, so I think it was probably not unlike what it was for a lot of American communities. It was scary, it was unnerving, there was a lot of trauma, there was a lot of dislocation, and there were multiple pandemics, right? Mm-hmm. So vast communities and young people and families experienced food insecurity, and they experienced poverty in harsher ways, and racism. So it's been tough. The thing that strikes me about this region is how localized the experience is. I know people use the word hyper-local, but again, let me situate here. So just right here in this county, Allegheny County, where I am right now, there are 43 school districts. Pennsylvania, a lot like the state of Illinois, is an example of Jacksonian democracy run amok. And we've got so many municipalities and school districts, and so there's an unusual number of school districts in this little place. And I mention that to say that there are some students who went back to school full-time every day, 5 days a week, beginning of Labor Day of last year. They experienced an entire school year, not unlike any other school year. Now, it's not that they weren't navigating a pandemic, but they had full-time options available to them. And there are other school districts that didn't open a door until May, 9-10 months later. And the families that experience that can literally be a stone's throw away. And so I mention that because that creates a very different experience. And so when we start to talk about Pittsburgh solutions, let alone Pennsylvania or American solutions to what it is that we need to do to accelerate learning for our young people, we have to be mindful that they've had vastly remarkable different experiences, even in the places where we are and could easily travel to.
Yeah, so based on that, backdrop, what did you find worked to keep? And I know, I love the word wondering, so what did you find worked to give children remarkable learning experiences despite multiple pandemics?
Yeah, there's so much that worked, and we can't applaud our educators enough. Much as we can't applaud our healthcare workers enough, educators were amazing in all of these settings. No matter what decisions they made. There were some schools that didn't miss a beat. Now, that didn't mean that they went from full-time to full-time, but some of them had done years of work around culture building, around the use of educational technologies, and they transitioned to either remote or hybrid learning in really remarkable ways. So that was incredibly uplifting, that the tedious work of culture building, professional learning, making different investments, yielded paid off in a huge way. We also saw places like Carnegie Mellon University working with private companies to use MetaMesh technology to expand broadband access, as well as obvious device access for young people in remarkable ways. We saw the role of our field building organizations, our intermediaries, like an organization like Trying Together, which supports the early learning field here locally, come forward in remarkable ways to help families find childcare in new ways using Childcare Finder. We saw our out-of-school time organization, it's known as APOST locally, but out-of-school time organizations worked together with a governmental unit, our Department of Human Services, to design learning hubs and staff those learning hubs with high-quality educators, both from the field of education formally, but also from the out-of-school time space, and create amazing community-based learning hubs for young people and their families. And there was
were these learning hubs physical?
They were physical learning hubs. all around the county, and better yet, there was a deliberate attention to socioeconomic factors. So as they designed where these hubs were, these physical locations, they were really mindful of economic dislocation, disadvantage, who needs these spaces the most in terms of supporting young people and their families. And so, and the other thing I'd say is media coverage. I think of a platform locally like kidsburg.org, which has been now around for 10, 15 years in our region, which is a partnership among a number of media entities. And they cover the stories that matter to families, kids, and educators. How having that sort of platform was so helpful in terms of providing guidance and instruction and outlets for families. So there's a lot that worked. And in so many ways, it was the years of unsexy, tedious, smart investment in building an infrastructure that then paid off.
That's why I was so excited to have this conversation with you, Greg. I am curious. I know we talked a little bit about data collection and how there's so many variables that it's rocket science. But I'm almost wondering whether the level of data collection has to be at this sort of larger, maybe even statewide or county-wide comparison across other counties to see whether the children in Allegheny County had a different experience compared to the rest of the, because I can see that the level of investment that has been made in this county is much higher compared to any other, and there's a lot of thoughtful planning that has gone into it that you said resulted in this.
Yeah, well, I won't pretend to be a data scientist. So yeah, I would say yes, right? Because it goes back to that very localized experience of Allegheny County versus a county right next door like Westmoreland, or the state of Pennsylvania, or a county across the country in Oklahoma. What I will say is that, I think of the work at our Children's Hospital of Pittsburgh with their a deep longitudinal study they have underway called the Pittsburgh Study. The work that our Allegheny County Department of Human Services has done over the past 20 years in building out a data warehouse and then putting in place all sorts of data sharing agreements with organizations and school districts. And then those relationships that you spoke to earlier, the relationships among organizations called Allies for Children and our United Way and the Poise Foundation, how they were able to quickly come together and to be able, start tracking needs right away and having immediate information about food insecurity or cash assistance needs or utilities, let alone educational opportunities, how important that data was to setting up things like the learning hubs and being able to do so with more deliberate attention to equity and justice, because we had the data to drive where those investments needed to be.
It's so interesting. I mean, I think I'm sure you read that article on like collective impact and like how it takes so much work to align metrics of success and have sort of the backbone organization. I feel like maybe the Grable Foundation is one of the backbone organizations, right? Like bringing everybody together. And it's making me think that just because you had these irregular convenings of people, there was a lot of trust, understanding. So when there's a crisis, you can work together way faster.
Well, thank you. And let me just note, so at the Grable Foundation, we're lucky enough to give away money. I mean, right? So, and we're only successful to the extent that the organizations achieve results are successful. So the Grable Foundation, together with lots of other funders, both private funders and public funders in this community, came to, have long supported those field building organizations. They're the ones who deserve massive credit. Yeah. So whether it's an educational service agency like the Allegheny Intermediate Unit, or organizations like APOST and Trying Together and the Mentoring Partnership and Allies for Children, having that whole infrastructure of field building organizations that in turn are supporting, say, hundreds of early childhood centers or hundreds of out-of-school time organizations, they're the ones who deserve all the credit for building out that infrastructure that then is responsive to the needs of families and neighborhoods and educators.
So, I feel I want to dig into that a little bit later. So what surprised you?
Yeah, so I would say a couple things surprised me, or are surprising me now. I'm really surprised by this flow of public dollars. I have to admit, I'm a public policy wonk. I would have dreamed about the flow of public dollars that Congress and our state governments have made available, but I'm I have to admit, I'm still surprised that it's actually happening. And so that has surprised me because it really does present a once in a generation opportunity to invest in infrastructure and put a massive dent in poverty. So that surprised me. I'd say the other thing that has surprised me is the hunger for forging ahead and looking ahead to a post-pandemic learning future. And I cite some work that Remake Learning has done over this past spring, right? As we're still in the middle of a pandemic, and we still are in a pandemic. And Remake Learning put out a grant opportunity called the Moonshots, right? So there were 4 foundations, including the Grable Foundation, that came together. And it's essentially $1 million of seed funds to support R&D and thinking about what is it that we need in our schools, museums, libraries, other sites of learning after the pandemic. And I mentioned that to say that there were 90 applicants for what amounted to so far 7 grants. Right? So just that nearly 100 number of organizations or clusters of organizations came together. I guess it doesn't, on one hand, it doesn't surprise me because I think our educators in this region are and have been amazing. And yet in the midst of everything and dealing with stress and trauma and uncertainties, half their head is still focused on where do we need to be. And that to me is completely awe-inspiring and encouraging.
Yeah, for sure. Human optimism, right? That's what keeps us going. We take on big projects. So Gregg, tell us about you and your own journey leading Remake Learning, and looking back, what would you do differently? I don't think anything needs to be done differently looking at it from here.
I would do 1,000 things differently, I'm sure. Hindsight is always an easier place to be. And you know this, Tara, right? Leadership can sometimes be a very lonely place. And there are things that you wish you could say, wish you could tell, wish people would know about why and how decisions are being made. And I'm lucky to co-chair Remake Learning together with Valerie Kinlock, who's the Dean at the School of Education at the University of Pittsburgh, and then Jim DeNova, who just 2 days ago retired from the Benham Foundation. And we have a group of 60 or so executives of schools, museums, libraries, along with learning scientists and data scientists from places like the University of Pittsburgh and Carnegie Mellon University, who are there alongside of us in the Remake Learning Council. So I'm sure all of us along the way would make different decisions. One thing, one lesson of this pandemic that I've been thinking a lot lately is this year demonstrated how quickly we can accelerate forward, much more than I think any of us would have ever guessed. And so I've been wondering a lot lately, have we been too timid? Even when I think we've been ambitious and we've really pushed things forward, have we been too timid around issues of justice? Have we been too timid about issues of innovation? Should we be thinking not about moonshots, but like Pluto shots? Are we thinking big and boldly enough? Which is why I go back to that flow of public dollars. That's why I think this moment in America for communities all across America is so important and so powerful, because we really do have a once in a generation opportunity to get some things right, as well as to accelerate forward in some massive ways. And
so I'm very curious, that was going to be my next question. What do you think, what is an example of a Pluto shot?
I don't know that I have the answers, but what I will say, so last summer, and then again this spring, Remake Learning convened essentially a commission on the future of learning. And this spring worked with Knowledge Works out of Cincinnati and our Pennsylvania Department of Education to pull together a panel on innovation in teaching and learning. And there are some concrete ideas that have come forward in that panel, and I'll give you one. I'm not sure it's a Pluto shot, but to me, it's a big thinking. So we know how important relationships are for young people. Not a surprise, certainly not a Pluto shot. And yet, have we done all we can to build an infrastructure to support genuine relationship building and that atmosphere for learning that kids need, particularly in the school setting, to say nothing of all of those other learning settings? So what if every school in this country had a director of relationships? Someone whose job was not a counselor and not a teacher, but 24/7 was focused on how do I help this particular student and then that student build out their experience gap and build out their social capital and their relationships and their knowledge with people, with ideas anywhere in the world, right? 10 years ago, directors of instructional and innovation were a real novelty in schools. Now they're not.
Yeah.
Well, what if we invested in the human capital in helping every young person build out relationships in powerful ways and supported the human capital to do that?
Yeah, for sure.
At least a moonshot, if not a Pluto shot.
Yeah, I agree. I mean, and I think in Technovation, the girls, when after we asked them what did they learn, what surprised them the most, hands down, they say working in a team, because school doesn't provide that type of entrepreneur's experience where you have to butt heads and get your whole team to move forward, and that is an unforgettable experience. It bonds you right together, and so I can see that being very, very valuable. I think you talked a little bit about being very surprised by how innovative people have been throughout COVID. I think I saw that in our own network, and how volunteers rallied to get girls devices and learning opportunities. But we saw that over 2 years, and my worry now is that innovation and adaptability to immense change has probably come at a cost of energy, because it's not like everybody that I talked to had to innovate so much and surprise themselves by how fast they could move. But that's also because the whole world was aligned and fighting one problem. Yeah. And so you didn't have to waste time convincing one another of the importance of what you're trying to do. But I'm just wondering if there's an overall deficit in energy and in creativity after running so fast, and whether as a world we take a breath and pause, and because we're still in the pandemic.
Yeah, well, here I won't, just as I'm not a data scientist, I'm also not a psychologist or a health professional, but to your point, right? Part of innovation and creativity is allowing ourselves to go into that default mode.
Yeah.
And creating the time, the space, the quiet, or whatever it is that allows for that, and allows us to care for ourselves. Because we can't do great work on behalf of others unless we do care for ourselves. Now, this is pot calling kettle black, because I'm not, I don't take this advice so well myself, but it really is incumbent upon each of us as people, but also our institutions and our organizations to create those spaces, to respect those spaces, and to invest in the sort of mental health and well-being of ourselves and our organizations. Because it's only in that space that we can then continue to accelerate forward, and we really do need.
And there's a lot to be done.
Yeah, and it's interesting because you mentioned Fred Rogers earlier, and together with Ryan Ridzeski had this great opportunity to release a book 2 months ago called "When You Wonder You're Learning," and Fred, partly the work is about making clear what it is that Fred Rogers did in his iconic television program that launched nearly 50 years ago, right? And it tends to things that we would today call the learning sciences, and how we support curious environments, creative environments. And the thing that Fred got right in that context that's relevant to your question is, what is it that creates the atmosphere for learning? You can only be creative, you can only be collaborative if you feel safe, mentally and physically, if you feel like your questions are going to be respected, if you feel like you're loved and capable of loving. It also goes back to this idea of the director of relationships, right? Like, we have to create these atmospheres for learning, whether it's in our own homes, in our schools, in our libraries, or ideally across our cities and our communities and rural valleys. Like, we have to create this atmosphere for learning that is really genuinely rooted in love. And that can't be some soft idea. That has to be hardwired into the way that we think about great learning.
I agree. There's some echo. I wonder why there's echo.
Love.
So I'm curious, have you come across any organization that has some sort of playbook on making these kinds of very warm, safe spaces virtually?
Virtually. Oh, that's a great question. I don't know. That's a great question. I've not thought about that. I will say I've had the privilege recently of talking both with some ed tech companies, some gamers and others, and have offered that challenge myself in the sense that, you know, when we think about Fred Rogers taking the technology of his day, which was television, well, we think of the the innovators of our day using gaming or AR or virtual reality or whatever it might be. And could they apply those same principles, you know, in really thinking about, you know, Fred Rogers talked about his work as a visit, you know, and he thought about that one child or that one child together with a parent on the other side of this screen that you and I are looking into. Like, what would it mean for a gaming company to think about their work in the same way? I'm quite sure that there are folks out there doing it. And I look at, for example, the Science of Learning Development Alliance nationally and the work that SOLD, as it's known, has done. But I don't have a good answer to your question.
Yeah, we'll keep looking.
Yes.
So, Gregg, we didn't cover all our questions, but I want to make sure we leave time.
Wait, no, we're not at time.
So tell us about, this is my favorite question to everybody. What is one book we should read to be better human beings?
Well, I'll give you two answers. So one book, so one of my favorite books is probably one that I'm not sure it's in print or out of print, but it's a book that I fell in love with decades ago called Lest Innocent Blood Be Shed, written by Philip Halley. And it's and the book situates you in a village in Nazi-occupied France during World War II. And it's this wonderful story about how goodness happened in an unexpected place and in an unexpected time. And I mention that because it ties to this sense of goodness that I think Fred Rogers expressed so powerfully. And as at the Millennium, in an interview, when asked about a challenge for humanity, Fred Rogers said, "Our challenge is to make goodness attractive." And I sort of take that as a mantra for life. You know, what is the work that we can do, whether it's in the mundane, everyday things, or in those rare, grand sweeping moments that we can make goodness attractive. And so the second, you know, this book that I had the privilege of writing together with Ryan Ridzeski called When You Wonder, You're Learning. Mr. Rogers' enduring lessons for raising creative, curious, caring kids. We try and unpack the blueprints for learning that Fred Rogers left for us half a century ago, and make that entirely relevant using today's modern learning sciences as to why those blueprints are so powerfully important for us as we emerge from this pandemic and look to the years ahead. And at its core, it's about that challenge of making goodness attractive. So, which I find in Philip Halley's book, and ideally, we've done a decent enough job of integrating that sensibility into our book.
Thank you, Gregg. I'm amazed you found time to do this. So thank you. I'm going to buy it right away. Last question. What should we be working on with intention?
Always justice. Always justice. And it's work that I get a little bit better at every day. But the work of supporting our learners and everything that they are and the environments where they live require us to attend and be thoughtful about economic justice and racial justice and humanity. And so being deliberate about integrating justice into the work that we do and making goodness attractive is essential.
Yep. Thank you. I think last night I just saw the Kapoor Center released some frameworks for CS education from a justice lens, and there's 6 tenets, and I think those were very powerful. And so I think education for justice is what, but at different levels, right? And so I think that is exactly the mantra we need to take forward. So Gregg, thank you so much. I wish we could do many more of these. There's so much to uncover and learn together. Thank you. And thank you to all those who tuned in.
It's a privilege to be with you. Thank you.